Again, it's been a very tight agenda, but you can see when we were planning this and trying to figure out who to bring, there are so many wonderful options to consider, and I'm glad we did bring on so many people because you've had a wide range of voices. Many people are involved on this issue in the basin. And so moving on to this, really one of the last panel of the day before our closing comments by David Palumbo this afternoon and ending our conference. What we wanted to do in this session is take some time to digest everything that we've heard over the past 2 days and to reflect a little bit on the ideas and suggestions that have been proposed, and then to start diving into some concrete action that we can take across the basin, whether, whatever field, organization you're working with, what can you do to help take next steps to sustaining the river, to meeting all of the uses, all of these different concepts that we've heard over the past 2 days. And to help us do that, we have 4 really great panelists. 2 are representing individuals who have been in this field for a long time, who have already dedicated a long career to having these tough discussions and to proposing ideas and trying to be a leader and have established themselves as leaders. And then 2 individuals who are really representing the next generation. We all don't live forever, right? And so we have to figure out ways to pass on the knowledge that we have so that we don't have gaps and disruptions in this process. And so just really briefly, again, all of our panelists have full bios online, but our 2 established leaders here, we have Ann Castle returning, our senior fellow at the Getches Wilkinson Center at University of Colorado. We have Enrique, or Henry as you'll hear us call him, Martinez, who is the Imperial Irrigation District's Chief Executive. And then our 2 more recent emerging leaders, we have Crystal Tulley-Cordova, who's a principal hydrologist with Navajo Nation's Department of Water Resources, and John, forgot your last name fixed up there, Berggren, who's a water policy analyst for Western Resource Advocates. So one thing I want to point out before we start our discussion here is on Slido, there is a poll with 2 questions, and that will remain open through the end of the conference. You can still submit questions or comments in the tab that you have been using, but then there will be another tab you can click on to respond to these 2 questions. And we're going to be collecting the responses and then posting those on the event website afterwards. Because all of our audience engagement, right? Everyone here has their opinions and really important input. We want to take that opportunity of bringing so many of you here together to capture it so that we can look at it after the event and continue the conversation. So just wanted to note that really briefly. But to get us going, right? We've heard, again, just so much information to process. Based on the presentations that we've had over the past day and a half, what lessons do you think we have learned? Just to begin with. And I'd love, Henry, to get your initial response on that.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm somewhat of a newbie to the water world. Been spending most of my career on the power side and the fringes of water, working for IED now, but formerly with the Tennessee Valley Authority and also with the Department of Water and Power. So I've had quite a bit of interfaces with water and water use and power interfaces at the same time. It was great to spend the last couple of days here learning from many of you in regards to not only the history of the Colorado River, but also the more detailed intricacies of what's important about the river, and ultimately where do we go from here for the next century. I am a recovering engineer, and so I kind of vacillate between the left brain and the right brain quite often to keep myself in balance. But at the same time, I think, coming to realize here that this issue of the Colorado River is not only very important and critical to the West Coast and the Western United States, but also the fact that Mexico, is also a part of the whole chain of this whole process of collecting water, adjudicating water, and also providing in essence the pipeline and the lifeline to a lot of industry and development and health and welfare of citizens throughout the West Coast and Western United States. Is a critical element that we just cannot ignore and throw our hands up and walk away from it. It is going back to the aspect of the compacts, and as it was stated in 1922, things were a lot different than they are today. I think the anticipation of what would have happened 100 years later was never even conceived in their mind, other than trying to fix what was really a wild river that created not only a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of problems. I was thinking about the aspect of, what preceded the Colorado River and ultimately how the federal government saw the aspects of not only controlling the river, but also maximizing its value for economic development and growth. And part of the realization that came to me as I was sitting here thinking about it is also how the Tennessee River basically was controlled by the federal government to also implement the aspects of flooding, basically, which was a big issue, and was here in the Colorado River as well. The other part was navigation. There was another element of the objectives of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and then lastly, power development. So it kind of mirrored the aspects of how I think the federal government looked at this aspect of developing this river. But in doing so, it basically optimized the aspect of the economic development versus the environmental issues. Thinking back, the environmental issues was not a big issue back in those years either. It's just, I remember talking to several older predecessors that I worked with, and we always wondered how things were done back in the early teens, projects that were built in those years that in today's environment would never we built. Cutting roads, going to forest, crossing streams, moving water from one basin to another. It was just a matter of things that happened and were created in that manner without thinking about the environmental impacts and ultimately how the landscape would change and ultimately what harm it would cause to certain basins. But we have what we have today. And I think, going forward, we got to take the lessons learned of what mistakes were made, or at least what was ignored back in those years. And as we go forward, start implementing those processes into how we can better improve the whole development of the system and address the really critical aspects of how the river is being not only affected today, but ultimately how the water itself would be distributed in a way that will be positive and sustainable and maintain the aspects of longevity and stability. Because I think ultimately at the end of the day, this is something that not only the environmental community sees, the tribal community, but every single part of the infrastructure that's developed here in this Western United States, it has to be kept in mind. And then lastly, I think just from the perspective of the inclusion, the social values today are a lot different than they were back in those years. I think the aspect of what is the beneficial use is another aspect that needs to be clearly defined. It is subjective to some extent, and I think this is where the prioritization of what water priorities should be at some point indicating as you start stacking the beneficial use or beneficial value of the water, should start dictating to some extent how a limited amount of water can be distributed for maximum beneficial use of everybody that's interested in the river. So those are some of the big thoughts I had about this matter, and again, I think there's just a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm towards the end of my career. I'm looking forward to seeing the next generation kind of pick up where we left off, not repeat the same mistakes that many of us have encountered ourselves or learned from, and basically take us to the next level.
Thanks.
Thank
John, I'm interested to see your take as kind of, again, younger. What lessons do you think, looking back?
Yeah, so I think the lessons goes back, I think, first of all, to the aspect of, realizing that, number one, things will never be the same. Contractually, typically, the contracts that, you would have is one that and just thinking out loud here, one of the things I always thought about is that these contracts should be basically reviewed every 10 or some period of time. On a normal contract basis, you have off-ramps, in essence, they're called off-ramps, where you enter into an agreement, but periodically you have the opportunity to go back and revise it and renegotiate terms based on the conditions that exist, whether a financial decision or a force majeure or something that happens that forces you to go back and say, we got to reopen up this contract and reestablish the parameters of the contract. The Colorado River contract has pretty much been, I would say, fixed in its fundamental aspects. It's been adjusted over time. It's been flexible by cooperation, but in essence, it doesn't have the contractual obligation to be reopened and relooked at. And I think that's one of the lessons learned we ought to be thinking about. The other part is the issue of what I would say, the changing environment and the socioeconomic value of how society is today. And it will change in the next 10 or 20 years again. It won't be the same, and I think this is another aspect that may also provide an avenue to say, or at least to revisit the aspects of the fundamental assumptions that were made and determine whether those societal values are still there and justifiable to maintain the parameters of the utilization of water and the resources that are accumulated by the river. So I think those are the two things that I would say are fundamental. And then I guess the last one, it's just as important, is the inclusion aspect. I keep going back to that picture that was shown in 1922, a small group of people that basically took information and they did the best job they could. But it was basically a very close aspect of decision making. I think now today, the process, not only the federal government has therefore processes for more inclusion and open, conversation in decision making that should be utilized. But I think in general, there's more awareness of what the impacts are from different fields in different areas of our communities, and that should be brought into the discussion before a final decision is made. So I think the part of inclusion definitely and cooperation has to be part of the future going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, well, and that kind of brings us to the next line of questioning. The phrase is really popular for a reason, right? Hindsight is 20/20, because it's easier for us now to look back and reflect and think of what we didn't do right. So going forward then, to make sure that the path we do move forward on is the most informed, makes the most sense, what goals should we be setting out to accomplish? And initially I want to look at like the 5-year kind of immediate time frame. And Anne, I'd love to get your thoughts. What do you think are the most important goals that we should be achieving in the next 5 years?
Yes, and first I want to point out that Heather has been very diplomatic and tactful in referring to Henry and me as the established people in the basin. So I just want to be real clear that we're here to represent the old fart demographic, and you can feel free to discount our remarks however you think is appropriate. So the most important goal in my mind for the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 100 years is solving the math problem. we have an imbalance between supply and demand, and we have to bring that equation back into balance in order to be able to have a viable, usable river system. And I think we've heard from a number of different people that in order to do that in the most responsive way, we need to use hydrologic triggers to operate the system, meaning that right now we base deliveries and delivery reductions and required contributions on Lake Mead elevations. And that's kind of a proxy for hydrology, but it's indirect. And I think that in order to have a responsive system going forward, we need to use the hydrology, look at the 5-year average or something like that, and use that to tell us how much water we can use from the system. I also think that those conversations are going on right now for the short-term balancing of the system, because we need to, but that, as has also been said this afternoon, that will provide a platform for the longer-term agreement. And then the last thing I would say in terms of goals is in the Colorado River system, we have the two biggest reservoirs in the United States. And those reservoirs are a tremendous asset in managing water for the benefit of the whole basin. And I say that recognizing that the existence of those reservoirs has caused significant environmental damage. But from a water operations standpoint, having those reservoirs gives us a ton of flexibility that we wouldn't otherwise have. But that's only true if they have water in them. And they don't do us much good when they're empty. So I would say that a goal, and this is a longer term goal, will be to do some storage recovery so that we can take advantage of the asset that those reservoirs provide and use them to deal with the natural volatility in this river system that will continue regardless of the climate change trajectory, but that we use the reservoirs for that flexibility to deal with the volatileness of the system and not to deal with systemic overuse.
So Crystal, you're going to be working on these issues much past a 5-year horizon. For you, what goals do you think are really important? And looking out, beyond the immediate concerns, are they different? What do you think if we're looking at long-term 100-year time frame? What would you say are our most important goals?
I think our most important goals are being adaptive. And as an example of that, I'd beg each of you to think about when you were in elementary school and what you wanted to be when you grew up. And then moving on to high school, maybe changing that. But then those actions that you've had along the way have brought you to where you are today. So some of you may be representing leadership at federal agencies. You may be an accomplished author or a scientist putting new ideas out there, or encouraging us from a recreational perspective to think about the river in a different way and gain perspective. And our actions along the way create the opportunity to be able to include things like consciously moving toward a goal, being able to be innovative in our approaches while also being strategic, and having the opportunity to be able to accept feedback that is critical. I know we have some authors in the room, and maybe not just of books, but also of peer-reviewed articles. And I don't know how many of you have thought you did the best work that you could, and then you submitted it for publishing, only to realize that the reader had not the same ideas that you had when they interpreted whatever you wrote. And so with that being said, I think it's important to be considering the short and long-term goals of what we may be considering for the next 100 years. Oftentimes, as I move through my position that I'm being adaptable in what I have to do for the Navajo Nation. And then, I thought I had a good understanding of my role when I came on pre-pandemic, only to realize that completely changed once the pandemic hit. And I had to be able to focus on different water-related issues to access. So I think it's important to be adaptable in a process, to have an understanding that things written in stone are maybe not necessarily the best way to go about things, especially with things like water. I mean, when you look at the Grand Canyon and you have that understanding of over millions of years, it has come to be what it is today, then you have that understanding of adaptability and how things have progressed and changed.
Thanks. And I think, we've heard this a little bit from some other panelists, talking about our short-term concerns and our long-term concerns. And it seems to me that it is important to be thinking, all right, immediate, right now, what do we need to do? But then we also need to have our long-term goals. Do those sometimes conflict with one another, though? Do we run a risk sometimes of trying to put on that Band-Aid and dealing with an immediate problem, and the way we go about it has then harmed one of our longer term goals or set us back in achieving, whatever the long sustainability in 100 years? How do we balance those competing demands of meeting the needs of people right now, but then ensuring the viability of the river, the basin, the people in those communities in the future? Any thoughts on that?
Well, if I just add on that, I think one of our panelists, and I can't remember who had said it, but I think the planning has to be in a short-term, long-term aspect. One of the things that it dawned on me, and I guess just listening to the comments made, that the reality of staying with the old traditional, or at least what the contract of the Colorado River was based on, is maybe flawed, going back to Ann's comment about the balance that we have. The short-term solutions basically can provide a baseline for the long-term aspects of the river, and it, in some economic trends they call it the black swan model, which basically is that one that comes one time out of 1,000 times. So, and it's not necessarily the worst-case scenario, but something just happens. It is not the traditional projection of what a model would bring. And that's maybe the one that we ought to be focusing on, to say, well, what is the worst case scenario that may happen here? I heard the word, at least the numbers, is it 7 million acre feet a year? Is it 11 million acre feet a year? Some plan around that aspect should be maybe defined in a way to determine what operational changes are required, but also what balancing needs to happen between the water available and the water use that can be applied. That would give at least a model, or at least a platform of what decisions need to be made in the long term to adjust in time versus a crash of the system. And I think those planning issues, taking the information that's available, can provide at least a projection of what to start looking for. And where are the fatal flaws that may happen? What are the impacts that are going to happen to the environment? What are the impacts going to happen to the population that receives the water? What industrial impacts may have, or financial impacts may have on the economy in general? Because those are the things that drive a lot of the aspects of of the society, and not necessarily say that those are the bad things that you need to think about, but ultimately the impacts are going to be the repercussions we have to deal with. And I can just think about the aspects of industry in general, for one, being impacted negatively, and having a lot of joblessness, for instance, that can not survive without the water availability, or the fact that was stated a number of times, just the basic service of having water for people. It's happening in the tribes. It's happening in California. You think in these times everybody should have clean, affordable water, and it's not the case. And those are some of the key drivers, I think, that we need to keep in mind. Ultimately, the consequences of a shortage water, and you overuse, in some cases, water availability. I think those are the two things that can work in parallel, thinking about the short-term and long-term plans.
Yeah. And moving over into what action we need to take, how do we achieve those goals? I'd love to turn to you, John, to tell us, what are we missing right now? Are there additional steps we need to take to achieve the goals that we've been talking about, solving the math problem, putting in adaptive management systems? What do you think is missing, or how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it builds upon this discussion we just had on the short term versus long term. And I agree with Henry. You kind of have to do both at the same time. And I think the opportunity for the long term is built into the short term, right? So you can, as we've learned in this basin, there's a lot of interim agreements, a lot of learning, a lot of figuring out, trying something, taking your lessons learned and applying them going forward. This short-term deal, as hard as it's going to be, as much of a emergency we're in, there's opportunities to learn. And so I think we should not miss that opportunity to include a broader group of decision makers, the tribes, other and stakeholders in those drought operations in this emergency short term to get us to 2026, and then take those lessons learned about those processes. How effective was that, bringing those more inclusive, diverse voices to that short-term process, and applying that to a more long-term vision on the river. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to learn from both the short-term and apply those to long-term, but doing them simultaneously. Thinking about kind of what's missing, I thought it was really interesting yesterday, which was this kind of retrospective of how we got here. There a lot of lessons learned, including a lot of folks saying we thought outside the box. We tried something new. We experimented and it worked. Obviously, there's plenty of times where it might not work, but that idea of thinking outside the box, looking back, was really essential for getting some of these deals done. I think that same level of outside the box thinking is necessary for going forward, and we should apply that same way of thinking. Today I think we heard a bit more restraint in how we should be thinking on these longer term, both short and long term solutions. Constraining the NEPA process, keeping it just to a plumbing decision, a plumbing agreement. I think it's important to think more broadly and apply those lessons that we've learned, that thinking outside the box can actually get you to really effective solutions. Bringing more folks in can get you to more sustainable, more resilient solutions. Before I was working for Western Resource Advocates, I was in grad school studying the Colorado River, and as part of that, I did a big survey many years back to the CRUA membership. So I'm sure many of the folks in this room, thank you for taking that survey. And one of the questions I asked were the 2007 interim guidelines and was Minute 319, were those fundamental changes to the law of the river? In other words, more of that outside the box thinking. The vast majority of respondents said yes. Looking back, those two agreements were fundamental changes to the law of the river. I think one of the next questions I asked was, going forward, do we need more fundamental changes to the law of the river? Vast majority said no. So there's a disconnect between what we've done and what we're capable of as a basin, like we heard yesterday, and what is possible going forward. So I think that's one of the things, I don't know if it's missing, but it needs to be further driven into the narrative that yes, it might be outside the box. Yes, we might have not done it before, but you might get to better, more sustainable long-term solutions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Could I add to that, Heather?
Yeah, please.
Just in terms of what additional tools do we need? One of the things I want to recognize is that we have the tremendous advantage in this basin of having trusted data, trusted modeling, because we all look to the Bureau of Reclamation and its data collection, and the USGS and its data collection, reclamation's modeling, and we all benefit from that. And I will admit to be something of a reclamation fangirl, but it's true that this agreement on data doesn't exist in all basins, and it gets you way past a whole bunch of unproductive arguments if we can agree on the facts. However, we need better data and better modeling. And for example, Jack talked about how the ecosystems are very dependent on the temperature of the river, the thermal band that the water is in. Well, we don't model that very much. Now, Jack's group is working on that, but those are things that you manage what you can measure, right? And if you're not measuring it, if you're not modeling it, then we're not managing it very well. We don't have the tools. We need to expand the data that we're using to model the system. And we also need to get a way better handle on consumptive use in the Upper Basin in particular. I'm going to disagree with Jay a little bit. The Upper Basin does measure diversions. It's not that we don't do that, but our consumptive use estimates are, I will say, relatively crude. We could do a better job. We can use satellite measurement. We can use OpenET. We can have better data. And that's one of the fundamental takes from the system. We need to be able to be confident in the Upper Basin consumptive use. So those are the kind of additional tools I think we need and will help us manage the system more sustainably.
Yeah, so we've heard kind of two concepts here about the need to include diverse voices, but then also improving our modeling. And Crystal, I've heard you bring both of those concepts together. And a discussion we had previously that past modeling has sometimes been narrowly constructed and hasn't included all of the relevant factors and impacts. So I wonder if you can comment on that a little bit of how this concept of diverse voices and inputs can help us solve some of these modeling issues and make sure that we're, doing the best science we can. And
yeah, so an example of my research was looking at precipitation across the Navajo Nation, and then also doing another project looking at stable isotopes across the Navajo Nation, both of which there was debate, how far north the North American monsoon goes, and a lot of work has been done in Tucson with regards to stable isotopes, and also as far as estimating temperature and precip on the Navajo Nation. What was representative in Winslow, Arizona was supposed to represent all of the Navajo Nation. So that's a mere example to state that there's information more that can be done, more variables that can be included in models that are not already included, that have significant information. Whereas, the work that I did in looking at precipitation variability across the Navajo Nation, if anyone were to drive north to south or east to west across the Navajo Nation with the vegetative changes, you can definitely tell that there are precipitation changes. And so the research that I did was using Navajo data that we have to be able to describe the 5 hydroclimatic regions across the Navajo Nation, describing what the inter and intra variability is across the Navajo Nation, and then also on the flip side of stable isotopes, being able to determine, what's that connection between precipitation, groundwater, streams, as well as springs, and have a better understanding of, what those isotopic signatures can tell us. And so with models, we have a lot of models that are going in right now, but what is not very concrete are the variables that are from the tribal perspective. Being able to include some of that information in there is important. And granted, there are challenges associated with that because of data sovereignty and, who's running the research and why is the research being done? Could that possibly hurt tribes in the long run by being able to share some of that data? But I think through the opportunities that we have now in working with different entities, we as the Navajo Nation work with federal partners, state partners, and academic institutions to be able to do research that is more collaborative in approach in order to answer questions that are beneficial to both parties.
If I may add, and I think the concepts of the data is great, and I think in many cases that puts the issue more clarified, or at least more explainable as to what's going on with the data or the river situation. But underneath it all, I think at the end of the day is really the trust issue, that the data itself can be trusted and is believable. That goes back to the elements of having the ability to have the relationships, frankly, that whomever you're speaking to, presenting to, or explaining to can also trust that you as an individual or you as an organization is providing, in essence, a balanced approach, or at least a balanced solution to what you're trying to propose. In my career, this has kind of been we get past the data very quickly to say either it's good or bad. What makes it, frankly, come to a solution or an agreement is the relationship. And I think that's very fundamental for anything that of consequence that's going to happen with this river here. It has to be a level of trust that all the players, in essence, that have something to say can be trusted and has the ability to at least gain that level of comfort that you are on the same plane and you're trying to achieve the same objectives. I go back to the comments that were made here with Mexico. There's a whole aspect of concern about what is the information really valid that we're presenting? Is it truly that we really have a drought here in the upper states? I mean, in the upper basin, lower basin. How do we cross that aspect of having the trust, in essence, or at least the comfort that they believe what we're saying here? There's a lot of apprehension in regards to, do we really have a problem in the Colorado River? And we're asking Mexico to be part of the solution to help us stabilize the river. So it comes to how do we build relationships that go beyond just the data, because the data is just one point, a starting point, but ultimately it comes down to having that strong relationships to make finally the agreements come to a fruition. And that's the personal aspect of the organizations and the leaders of each organization have.
Yeah. Which looking to leaders and the role that leadership plays in accomplishing goals or maybe hindering it, and sometimes we've had some audience comments. For example, it was, can we ever have a truly adaptable river management system if we don't decouple management from the political process? So I'd love maybe Anne, if you start, and then Crystal, if you can kind of give your perspective afterwards of how has it historically helped with basin management, with solving problems? How could we be better in accomplishing our goals? And then Crystal, when you respond, how can we transfer the guard from our leaders that have been in place but are moving into retirement to the emerging leaders? Just love to hear you reflect a little bit on the role of leadership. And
I think it's a really insightful question, asking, can we make progress if we don't decouple management from leadership? And I don't think it's possible to totally break that connection. But I resonated with Brad Udall's comment this morning, his fear that it may be politically easier to watch the system crash than to take a difficult position that will involve a compromise, that will involve pain to your constituents, and suffer the political consequences of taking that position. I worry about that a lot. But that puts a premium on leadership. Yeah. And I think that we've heard a little bit about the lack of a formal governance structure in the Colorado River Basin, and there's pros and cons to that. But I think it allows for more emerging leadership, for people to step forward, people who have good ideas, to make themselves heard. I think there's more opportunity for that in this basin because we don't have a formal leadership structure. And so there's, I think, a better receptivity to good ideas, regardless of where those come from. The last thing I'll say about leadership is leaders determine the scope of what gets talked about. And we heard about that today in connection with, what's the scope of the NEPA process? Is it just plumbing, puts and takes in the system, or is it broader than that? And the one idea I want to put out on that issue is various different representatives and entities have made absolutely good faith commitments to be more inclusive and particularly to include tribal sovereigns in these river management discussions. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I take those commitments to have been made in good faith. But I think we have to recognize that if we're saying we will include tribal nations in river management discussions, that they will bring different values to those discussions, and that it's not sufficient to say we want you at the table if we've excluded those values from the conversation. And so I want us to think about that when we're scoping how those discussions go in the future.
And I know we can continue for just a couple minutes, but Anne does have a flight to catch. So Anne, what I'd love to hear from you before, and then you can feel free to leave at any time. But what kind of message do you have for our participants? If they have one takeaway or one charge of action for them, I think everyone is here because they care about these issues. What's your charge to the participants?
I would say that what we've heard over the past 2 days is that we have to recognize the inherent limits in the system that we all care about and enjoy. And that's not going to be easy. This river system is an amazing thing. It's an amazing asset, whether it's 17 million acre feet a year or 10. But we have to provide for living within that climate change affected system and figure out how we're going to make the trade-offs that are required. And I'm not saying that's easy. There's a whole bunch of equities to balance in doing that. I mean, we've heard all the different perspectives, and part of this conversation is I've borne all the pain already. Somebody else has to do the rest. But I think we can't take that attitude, and that we all have to share in this equally. I think we can do that. I think the basin has shown that it can make those kinds of adjustments, but that's, I think, the perspective that we have to bring to the conversation.
Thank you. And so we'll let Anne sneak out if she needs to. But
I hate to leave the party.
I know.
But just a couple more for our remaining panelists. We've in order to have the hard discussions that we need to have, right? We need and involve all of the different perspectives and voices that we need to have involved in those discussions. I think we need to create safe and collaborative spaces that we don't really have right now. And I'll share a little personal example from from my experience. As a recent graduate, I don't know, 12 years ago, I was applying for a job with a not to be named state agency. And I'm very proud of being Dene. I'm very proud of my heritage. And Nora's story deeply touched me because, and I've heard Crystal talk about being a Dene woman too, because those values, they're just part of our lives. They're part of our family. And so we're very familiar with them, and but many aren't unless we're sharing that experience with them. And so in my interview, of course I said, yeah, of course I'm Dene, right? Family down outside of Gallup, New Mexico. Parents are in Monument Valley. I was born in Montezuma Creek. And the question I got was, are you sure you can represent the state's interest without being prejudicial? That I would show favoritism if the state was ever dealing with my tribal nation. And I thought, do you ask this to anyone else? Right? I didn't get the job. That was 12 plus years ago. I think our environment has changed a little bit, but we're still not quite there yet. And so I want to know from our panelists, how can we create the spaces where people aren't defensive and where we have to have these tough discussions and have to come to the table and still be, even if we disagree, which we will still continue the discussions and working towards solutions. Who did I pick first? I think I had John. I think you, or anyone really, but kick us off.
Sure, I think that's a really good setup to the question. And one theme that's come up a lot yesterday and today, and then on this panel a lot, is values. And we've also heard it both explicitly and implicitly that our society has changing values, and they do change over time, and it's important to reflect those in our river basin management. Yesterday, when we heard a lot about the development of the compact and the negotiations and what went into that, I've dug a little bit into those transcripts and those discussions, and there's a really good testimony from Herbert Hoover, Chairman Hoover, back in 1926, shortly after the compact was signed but before ratified, and he's testifying before Congress and talking about that he didn't think they had the hubris to really decide something indefinitely or for 100 years or for a long time. He actually thought that it needed to be updated and changed based on society as it changes. And he's talking to the congressional panel and says, I am one of those who have a great deal of confidence that all anticipations over physical questions inevitably bend themselves to the forces of the life, and that if we can provide for equity for the next 40 to 75 years, we can trust to the generation after the next to be as intelligent as we are today. They will settle it in the light of the forces of their day. So I think it's a really telling quote of how he was thinking, at least, maybe not the rest of the commission, but he was thinking, and this is a great setup for how we should be thinking today. Things are different on this basin. Things have changed. Our values have changed. Our uses have changed. Climate has changed dramatically. And so I think there's in terms of solutions and going forward, we have to always have that in our mind that what we decide today, what we decide in 2026, what we decide in the future has to be adaptable. It has to be flexible. It has to respond to those changing societal values. And so as we've heard and we know, we've learned as a basin, we value things like tribal sovereignty, tribal determination, tribal water rights. That's important to us as a society today. We have to reflect our institutions and change our law to better demonstrate that. Environmental considerations, not considered at all in 1922 or 1926 when Hoover was talking. A great value to our society today. My organization focus on those environmental values, and the river itself. That's something that we really have to figure out how to work into both the short-term and long-term solutions for this river. Getting us to 2026, we can't exclude the environment, and post-2026, we cannot exclude impacts to the environment, impacts to the river. So I think that we have to always remember that what we decide today, future generations could have a different set of values, different set of perspectives. We need to allow them to be responsive in the future. So we can't have the arrogance to say that we're going to decide another big thing and not be able to reflect these changing values as they happen over decades and generations. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's kind of my thought.
Well, Crystal or Henry, anything you would add?
Go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to respond to is, you asked about how do we transfer the garden leadership? And then real simply, that's have a mentor and be a mentor. I was encouraged by Mina's words of inviting the generations after us to be able to come. I know sometimes it might be an HR nightmare to bring on interns or high school students to work for you. But in all honesty, our department has seen that grow. Our director, Jason John, was an undergraduate intern. He worked during his master's with our department, and now he's the director of the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources. And I myself was an intern with our department, so that change has occurred to be able to absorb the knowledge from the generation before me to be where I am now. But then also answering your question about, as we look ahead to the next 100 years, what do we need to do? We need to roll up our sleeves and we need to get to work. Some of you may already be thinking, well, I'm already working on these issues. And what we need to do, and what we've heard from the yesterday and today, is that we need to work harder. And we need to be able to address the challenges that are ahead, short term and long term. And there's no shortage of work. So there's no need to try and hog all the work to yourself, because there's plenty of work to be done. And, to put it simply, we can do more together.
Well, I think in general, there's no safe place to really be in a little cocoon. I think, part of the issue is that you need to be sure about the principles that you're representing. And in my case, the district, Imperial Irrigation District, is an irrigation district. It is focused around agriculture, and it's focused around community activities that we serve. And so to me, that drives, in essence, my message, my position in what I need to lead, and also provide a position to others in regards to what's important to our district. However, that being said, I got to be open. I got to be open as well to hear somebody else's opinion and be able to kind of sensitize the aspect of my position and their position to come up with better solutions. So it's not an aspect that you come in and you pound your fist on the table, you demand, but you state your positions clearly of where you want to be and what you think things ought to go. But also be open enough to absorb and listen to somebody else's opinion, because you get to learn something about something that maybe you may have missed or misunderstood in regards to what others may think. So being open-minded and be a better listener actually is what I would say is a safer way to go about it.
Just to add really quick to that, I think Crystal's point about not hogging the work is spot on for a lot of reasons, including many of what you heard in the last 2 days, which is time is short. It's hitting the fan, and we need to figure things out both in the short and long term. But because of these immense challenges, there's this capacity issue, and whether or not we have the capacity to deal with all of the challenges that we've heard about. And I think spreading the work is a great way to deal with those capacity issues, not just from getting things done, but it brings all the diverse perspectives into that discussion. So, like I said, I've kind of had an outside perspective historically, and I've been working for an environmental NGO, and getting to know this world, it is staggering the amount of brain power that the NGO world can bring to the table, and with ideas and feedback and constructive critique. I think building that capacity, using that capacity to deal with these short-term crises, which are immense and challenging, and the long-term solutions that we need. And the same on the tribal side. There's so much capacity that we can bring to this table, both within a formal NEPA process. If that NEPA process is constrained to reservoir operations, there's still capacity that we all can bring to that process. Outside of the NEPA process, if there's kind of parallel decision-making forums that emerge to deal with many of the challenges, there's so much capacity that the diverse group of sovereigns and stakeholders that could bring to the table. I think we would be dumb not to take advantage of that.
Thank you. And on that, we'll end with the question I posed to Anne before she had to leave. And we'll start with John, you at the end, and come down towards Crystal. What's your charge for our audience today after they leave the conference?
I think the charge for the audience is kind of what I was just talking about. Let's deal with the short-term crisis in a way that we can learn for the long-term solutions. And in 3 words that I kind of wrote down, I think that I heard in themes the last 2 days are the importance of proactive, empathetic leadership. And I think that's the charge that we need at all levels of government. So from the federal government, proactive, empathetic leadership is key. From the basin states, proactive, empathetic leadership is key. Tribal nations as well, all the way down. That level of thinking, understanding what the other states, what the other nations, what the other sovereigns are facing and what their needs are, what their challenges are. If we all can learn that and we have effective leadership that is empathetic to those different perspectives, we can develop those proactive solutions both in the short term and long term to avoid the catastrophic scenarios, avoid the day zero scenarios, get beyond this crisis narrative where we're just reactive, dealing with emergency operations, to the point where we can get to proactive, more resilient systems that we can then think about these bigger, more broad objectives like environmental considerations, focusing on the river. If we're away from that crisis narrative, away from that crisis situation, I think we can really get to a place where we can expand the options we have and better reflect the values that we've heard about as they continue to change, both with our generation and future generations.
Henry?
Well, I think number one, be realistic. I think in many cases we have different opinions of what may happen in the future, but I think we cannot ignore what is happening now and where the trend is heading. And it's not in a good direction. And I think that's something we really have to be willing and brave enough to admit that something needs to change, and change is hard. Secondly, I think the aspect of cooperativeness has to be at the centerpiece of this whole aspect to come up with creative solutions that basically addresses some very hard decisions that need to be made. And then, personally, from my perspective in my district, is recognizing the Salton Sea as part of the Colorado River. This has been a struggle for our district to recognize that there is a connection of the Colorado River to the Salton Sea, and ultimately that's kind of created more disparity and arguments about cooperativeness and solutions than establishing actually methods of addressing the problems in the long term. And I think, from that perspective, that's one example that basically, rather than bringing people together to a common cause, it splits people apart. And having some of those key aspects similar to that could come about. The tribal issues is another one. And I think the aspects of the environment is the third one. So those key elements that basically can sensitize people together to go for a common cause can also be a detraction, and can also basically not have people cooperate in the right direction. So that's kind of my closing. Thank you.
The most important action is to work together. By working together, we can save time and money and stay out of litigation.
Yeah.
Succinctly stated. Thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panel. I'll turn it over back to our team introduce our final speaker.
Thank you so much, past panel. That was really incredible. And before I bring up our final speaker of the day, when we were talking about putting this conference together, one of the things that we called, I called this last panel that just finished here, was the hope piece. We really wanted to bring together, seasoned individuals, and as well as the youth that hopefully is going to be creating the succession as we move forward. So really appreciate John and Crystal, and definitely Ann Castle should not have mentioned that she was a reclamation fangirl, because I'm going to call her RFG from now on. And I just wanted to say too that I really appreciate Eric Kuhn's comments, and what I got out of it is that donkeys need water too. And so, for the final panel of the day, and I was laughing about this too because Federal Friday afternoon. My good friend Dave Palumbo, we got to spend some time on the gates of Lador, and I really appreciated getting to know you. And even though we had known each other from before for many, many years, and I've always appreciated, your kindness and your generosity and your frankness and your willingness to listen. And I really appreciate that those are in federal positions right now are I consider my friends. We built that relationship. Is it perfect? No. But I mean, it's something that, that's way better than it was a long time ago. And Dave is playing right now, I think, acting commissioner, and hopefully Camille Touton will be back soon, and congratulate her and the birth of her child, and because she's on maternity leave right now. But normally his day job is, the deputy commissioner of operations. And so really appreciate, kind of final remarks in terms of the bookend. Tanya created some of that to begin with for the federal side. And then hopefully you can take us out here, David.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you all. Really appreciate it. Let me start off by sending you Camille's regards. She wishes she could be here. We're in contact a lot of beautiful pictures of her daughter, Sophie, and she can't wait to get out here to be with y'all. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you as well. I have truly missed this community. It's been a long 2 years. I've got a little bit of my COVID hair going on. I need a haircut, but let me just say, number one, you all are experts. You all deserve to be here, and we must learn from each other. I'd like to share some reflections on the themes and thoughts that resonated with me from the panels and integrate some of the thoughts on Reclamation's actions and activities. Let me just say, all of the panels and panelists were incredible. Great job putting this together. Just a tremendous feat. And it's very humbling to be amongst you all. The span that was covered from reflecting on the past through hindsight and ways in which to chart the future through foresight were expansive and motivating. The passion and emotion were inspiring. As Daryl noted, we are a river family. As youth spiritual leader Larry Sespuch prayed, we all have hope, and water is fundamental to life. And as Fort Mojave tribal member Nora McDonald remarked, all living things are interconnected, from plants to animals to microorganisms, and we must coexist. Her thoughts certainly deserved the standing ovation it received. As I reflected and tried to organize my thoughts, I identified an overarching theme and several of what I will call driving forward themes. Before I address these themes, I would like to recount Assistant Secretary Tanya Trujillo's remarks, identifying 3 overarching Colorado priorities for the Department of the Interior, working with our partners, all of you, and all of the values you bring. Again, they are taking immediate action to stabilize the system, to protect Glen Canyon operations for all the equities in the basin, engaging Colorado River tribal nations in a meaningful and enduring manner, and addressing longer-term imbalances in a collaborative and mutually beneficial way by preparing for post-2026 operations. There is much more to come on these priorities from Reclamation and Interior, and again, we will all need to work on them together. So the overarching theme, Togetherness is the only way to success. And I'll touch up on these a bit more. The driving forward themes: science and fact-based decisions and policies are needed. Equity and inclusion for all communities are needed. Valuing the environment is needed. A sense of urgency through thoughtful action is needed. And vehicles to affect these themes are needed. And I'm going to start in reverse order with the vehicles to address these themes. Larry McDonald's primer on the compact provided an excellent foundation of the cornerstone document we are all here to discuss on its 100th anniversary, even though, as Margaret Vick appropriately noted, we do not perceive this anniversary in the same way. With respect to renegotiating the compact, I certainly respect Bob Adler's thoughts regarding amending the compact and the compelling ways, some more difficult than others, to do that. I believe Assistant Secretary Ann Castle's identification that from a practical matter, this is not likely achievable, with perhaps the insurmountable obstacle of congressional ratification. Please don't get me wrong. I often daydream about a redo in many places across the West and the ability to incorporate what we know today, what we value today, and what we believe the future to be. While we do not have a readily accessible reset button, we do have other options. The law of the river has been built upon the cornerstone of the 1922 Compact with what I will call overlays, much in the same way as the minutes do to the 1944 treaty with Mexico. The 2007 guidelines, the drought contingency plans, the 500-plus plan are examples of these overlays, and the post-2026 guidelines will be the same. There is a progressive elaboration and evolution based on the body of knowledge, science, and societal values. We need to incorporate those in these documents. Of course, there is a need for immediate action, an immediate overlay now to protect Glen Canyon Dam. Science and fact-based decisions and policies. The work of Dr. Woodhouse and Dr. Prairie and the other incredibly smart scientists and researchers have demonstrated through robust and repeatable science that the drought we are experiencing may be in fact aridification, as Brad Udall identified this morning, and is the worst we have experienced not only in the instrumental period of record, but also the paleo record. And a sustained pluvial regime is not likely soon. Through the insightful historic work of John Fleck and Eric Kuhn, we know that political science is not the right science on which to base vital water resource management decisions. And no matter how inconvenient the right science is, it needs to be embraced. Across Western North America, those communities west of the 100th meridian, reclamation is managing through the compounding negative effects of climate change. The climate change we heard about in Kathy's panel with Brad, Tom, Amy, and Tina. To make Brad's point again, one of the mechanisms or feedbacks we are seeing is that as temperatures increase, ET increases, soil moisture often decreases, which negatively impacts runoff, and thus a climatological drought results in even worse hydraulic drought. Hence, 90% of average snowpack resulting in 30% of average runoff. This is not just happening in the Colorado River Basin, but also in the Rio Grande, Klamath, and Central Valley, to name a few. Reclamation is committed to basing our actions on the facts and scrutinizing and testing science, whether they be for immediate actions of today or the future actions for tomorrow. Equity and inclusion for all communities. Margaret, Bitta, Jason, Nora, and Jennifer, and many others appropriately identified that all communities not only need to be heard, but need to be part of the solution and at the table in a meaningful way. This morning, Daryl remarked that equity starts with inclusion. Reclamation is committed to an inclusive and respectful process. We are facilitating the capacity building that Jason referenced yesterday so that, for example, tribal nations feel equipped and empowered to assess risks and contribute perspectives at their own discretion. In reclamation, we have doubled our budget for our Tribal Technical Assistance Program and are developing processes for that capacity building. The map of the basin that Margaret identified that needs to show tribal lands will be made available in the coming week. Kaylee Nelson has been working on the product and has been committed to producing and using it. Thank you, Kaylee. I also want to note that reclamation is continuing through our Native American Affairs office in DC, which has strong connections to each region, and in the field office, training on tribal matters for our staff, managers, and leaders, including those related to water rights, to ensure we are knowledgeable and respectful, and our actions are considerate of the rights and positions of sovereign tribal nations. It's the right thing to do. Valuing the environment. The vital importance to the Delta that Oswald, Chris, and Jennifer cited yesterday hit this need home. There's a critical interconnectedness of all life to healthy, living, and sustainable rivers. They are the sole source of renewable freshwater resources. This resource, which we use for sustenance, for food and fiber production, for life. We need to ensure that our overlays on the compact provide for the natural environment and promote healthy ecosystems. Bob Adler appropriately identified our historic human focus of beneficial use. I think as a society and as a Colorado River community, we need to think of ecosystem services as human needs for the 40 million people the river serves. Ecosystem services, again, are human needs. As Daryl said, we are all part of a large ecosystem of the basin. Healthy terrestrial and aquatic species in the basin are beneficial and a prerequisite for healthy humans. Reclamation will fulfill all the environmental commitments we have made in our overlays and ensure that future overlays robustly include this human need. A sense of urgency and thoughtful action. As we've heard from so many of the panelists, the time to act is now. We do need to seize the moment. Again, as we heard from Assistant Secretary Trujillo, we need immediate and thoughtful actions to address the challenges at Glen Canyon. As John Ensminger and so many others noted, we need thoughtful consideration of likely basin inflows and how to balance demands with those supplies. Carly provided a great overview of our post-2026 planning and formally starting our pre-scoping efforts next month. We want a thoughtful and comprehensive NEPA process that addresses the varied perspectives on how to manage the basin. Future management will need to be equitable, flexible, nimble, adaptive, be based on plausible future supplies, and fundamentally rooted in best available science. Finally, the overarching theme, togetherness. From my perspective, former Assistant Secretary Ann Castle said it right. Everybody needs to claim victory. Everyone means states, water users, power contractors, farmers, tribes, Mexico, and NGOs. I would like to borrow Carlos de la Pera's remark and modify it slightly. All of the equities in the Colorado River Basin from this day forward are together for richer or poorer, in surplus and in shortage. Bob Kiter, sharing Wallace Stegner's words of hope and togetherness, was so appropriate before lunch yesterday. I'd like to repeat it. One cannot be pessimistic about the West. This is the native home of hope. When it fully learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the quality that most characterizes and preserves it, then it will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match its scenery. These words reminded me of one of my most favorite sayings, which is an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. While we need to go fast, we certainly need to go far. Cooperation and togetherness are how this basin has operated successfully and how we will be successful in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your words. And, and I'm just moved, in terms of, the relationships that we've built over this period of time and especially with our federal partners and, going back to Ken Salazar and Mike Connor and Esteban Lopez and Sally Jewell and Brenda Berman and forwarding these conversations, through that process and the willingness to grow that capacity of understanding on as far as tribal matters were concerned. So really, really appreciate that. And I think we're going to end there with that. And I'm going to bring Bob up here in a second. And I know that it's Friday, and I'm sure people would have lots of questions for you about what's going on there. But we're going to just leave it at that today. And just thank you so much. And again, thanks to Assistant Secretary Trujillo for taking the time to be with us yesterday. And thanks to all the federal staff that has worked so tirelessly in the recent times and in order to make all this happen as well. So definitely appreciate it, and definitely look forward to forwarding this conversation with Secretary Holland in a couple weeks in terms of the tribal specific conversation, but also being a willing partner in terms of offering up those solutions that we think are going to be collaborative and that are essential to the process as we build that capacity too. So thank you so much, David.
Thanks.
And I'm going to bring Bob up now, and then after Bob does a few remarks, I think we're going to say goodbye. So come on.
Thanks to everyone for your patience. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your attention over the last couple of days. This has certainly been inspiring, insightful, thoughtful approach to the Colorado River, which is a critical resource that we all share here in the West. Let me conclude with a couple of things. One, let me once again thank our speakers, many of whom traveled a good distance to be here, and we appreciate their taking their time to be with us. I can't enumerate everyone, but David in particular, thank you for summarizing, in essence, what we've heard over the last 2 days. And let me also thank the Planning Committee, and specifically Daryl, Matt, Jason, John Ruppel, and Heather. They worked tirelessly in order to bring us this program and to put together this tremendous array of speakers. And I'd like to also make a couple of announcements, I guess. One, fill out the evaluation form. Let me get that straight. For next year. It includes suggestions about potential future Stegner Center conferences, symposia. I'd appreciate that very much. It would be helpful to us as we have not yet settled on a topic for next year. For those of you around, we'll have additional green bag program in mid-April that will feature former Salt Lake City Mayor Ralph Becker, who will be with us, talk about the Central Wasatch Mountain Range and the future there. And finally, Pat, I'd like to thank you for the work that you've put in, but to share your artwork with us and your presentation today at noon. Very inspirational, and I wish I'd been on the river with you. And with that, let us all go forward. And I'm looking at the computer in front of me. Let's navigate the future of the Colorado River and the American West. Thank you.
And just real quickly, thank you again, everybody. And I was so touched, moved, and inspired by the panelists, and in the Tulla language, Hamas Pueblo, Ninda Hamo, till we see you again.